What if the reason therapy isn't working is because your nervous system can't hear it?
In today's episode of Mastering Change, we're joined by neurofeedback specialist Stuart Black, who breaks down what neurofeedback really does.
I've always wondered what neurofeedback was. I've always seen it as this hat that you wear with loads of wires coming out of your head. It's always intrigued me. If you guys have also been intrigued by what neurofeedback is, then this conversation is for you.
Stuart explains why neurofeedback can reach places that talk therapy can't, and why some people only start seeing real change once the nervous system gets this kind of support.
Let's see what he's got to say.
Stuart Black, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi, Stuart. Welcome. So each podcast we start with a little card game called Where Should I Begin, or Where Should We Begin? And I've just randomly selected a number of cards from the deck, and I will pull the first card and ask you it's a prompt essentially. So I'll say the prompt, and you can then kind of finish it up with some sort of story. So it says, I was never the same after ...
Ooh, I was never the same after a friend of ours died in 2017 and we took on her 3 children. So a friend of ours died in 2017, leaving 3 children behind, age 5, 6 and 14. And my partner, now my wife, and she was her best friend, took the children on. And we had to go to court 11 times, 8 times to the High Court before we became their special guardians. So yes, that turned all our lives upside down obviously in different ways, depending on who you were. And I've never been the same since.
Wow. Did you have other children before?
I haven't got any real children of my own, if I call it that. I had I brought up a stepson before, from the age of 7 to 14. And my wife has got 3 children who are now all grown up. Her youngest daughter, Krista, was 12 when this all happened. So obviously that was one of the first conversations we had with her about how she felt about bringing these 3 extra children into our home.
And if you don't mind me asking, if it's not too personal, we're 10 years on from that time. How was that journey?
Yeah, appreciate the caveat there, because one of the things we've sort of said is we're not going to talk about the children's individual challenges along that journey. But I think what it's done is it's opened up our eyes to a whole new world, really. The world of children who can't live with their parents. Because I think a lot of us who are blessed with the sort of the standard families, often, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else, never even thought of this world where this sort of sub-world that it turns out is right on our doorsteps, I now realise, of children who can't live with their families for whatever reason. They're either living in the care system with foster carers, or they're in children's homes, or they are with connected carers, kinship carers as we now call them, who may be related, they may not be related like us, they may be fostered, they may be under various types of arrangements. And I now realise, having seen the list of all the foster carers in Surrey, I know they're round the corner from me, and I never realised that. And the kinship carers we run as a support group, they're all over the place. They're all over the place. And one of the biggest challenges is trying to find others like them. And there's certainly tremendous value in people being able to meet other people in the same sort of boat that's been through similar sort of experiences. And of course, not being able to live with your birth family very often is traumatic. And there's various reasons why that comes about. In our case, there are no sort of salacious details before their mum died. That was traumatic, and they lost everything. They lost the place where they lived. They lost the people that they lived with, because they lived in Bedfordshire. We live in Surrey, so they had to move 100 miles. They lost everything, apart from each other, of course. And that was traumatic in its own way. And we all have different ways of coping, and we have different levels of resilience. So I think it's really opened my eyes up to the nature of trauma in many people's lives. We all have different levels of resilience, and we shouldn't sort of be too what would be the word, too religious about what we define as trauma. Trauma can be lots of things to lots of different people.
Great answer. Okay, and just before we go into how do you relate to the field, I welcome you to introduce yourselves to our audience in your own words.
Oh, right. Okay, so I'm Stuart Black. I live in Surrey, on the Surrey-Hampshire border. I am the managing director of an organisation called Applied Neurosciences. Beg pardon, Applied Neuroscience Solutions Limited. We trade as Brain Train UK. We've been offering therapeutic and peak performance intervention for the last 10 years. Before that, I spent more than 25 years leading change, often with an element of technology. I did a first degree in electronic engineering and computer systems. I did a second degree in executive coaching and development, which was based upon a transpersonal psychology called psychosynthesis. So it involved studying that. Yeah, that's me. And as I mentioned, I have a wife, and we have 6 children between us. She has 3 natural children, and we have 3 kinship children we are special guardians of.
Lovely. So let's delve into the field of trauma, mental health and wellbeing. I think from your introduction, we've got a little bit about your route into that, both from an academic perspective and also a lived experience perspective. But talk to us about what you wish our audience knew or understood in the context of your work and your what drives you every day.
Sure. Well, I've talked about my sort of personal connection with trauma. Professionally, what we do at Applied Neuroscience Solutions, or Brain Train UK, is we offer 2 things. One is we offer brain maps based upon the electroencephalogram, the EEG, or the brainwave patterns. So there's a kind of like a psychological X-ray of what's going on in your brain, how you respond, how you take information in from the outside world, how you tend to integrate it, how you tend to respond to what happens around you. And the second thing that we do is we offer a therapeutic intervention called neurofeedback therapy, which again uses the neuroscience of the electroencephalogram, the brain waves. We give you feedback on your brain waves, and we can do 3 things with that. 2 of them are most relevant to trauma. The first thing is we can enable the nervous system to re-regulate itself. When we go through trauma, very often our nervous system is dysregulated, which shows up as all sorts of symptoms, all sorts of, so-called mental health disorders. And that's the first thing we can do. The second thing we can do is we can enable you to process any traumatic memories which are stuck in your emotional brain. So they're no longer visceral emotions that you can't have a narrative around. Okay, if that makes sense. You can have a narrative around them afterwards, and you can control them. So you're controlling those memories rather than those memories controlling you. And the third thing we can do is we can exercise parts of the brain that we'd like to work better. That's less relevant to trauma, but it's relevant to things like brain damage, some learning difficulties. So that's really the professional connection with trauma. We see people with all sorts of challenges with regard to their mental health and well-being, but in particular, we see people with childhood trauma. Sadly, we don't see too many people with childhood trauma when they're still children. We see some of those. It's quite well known in the adoptive community now. We tend to see people with childhood trauma when they're older.
And why do you think that is? Why? Because the parents, the trauma that they have during childhood, parents are the perpetrators of that often, or that they're only recognizing that it was trauma when they get older, or parents aren't understanding that neurofeedback is a intervention, or all of the above?
I think, there's probably elements of all of the above. But if I was asked to summarize it, I'd say the reason we tend to see older people is because we tend to see people who've done their own research. They've been struggling all their lives very often. Very often, when you go through trauma, which is not remediated, you're in this high state of stress, what they call the allostatic load on your body, which is basically wear and tear. So you are much more vulnerable to chronic disease and illness, and sadly, early death. Your neurodevelopment gets disrupted, so there is a tendency to adopt risky behaviours and all the consequences of sort of that pathway. We meet people who've been struggling all their lives, and they're looking for something. They've tried conventional medicine, and they're looking for something different, and they find out about us. Very often they've got some sort of legacy, and they can actually get the help that they need. I think the challenge with the younger people is what we do does not fit into either of the current paradigms of mental health. So if I talk through that, what I mean by that is the first paradigm is the psychiatric paradigm. So this tends to see, and I'm generalizing here, it tends to see mental health as an issue of brain chemistry. Okay, so when you have got a mental health disorder, the world of psychiatry tends to understand it, rightly or wrongly, as an issue of an imbalance in the brain chemistry. And the solution is to change the brain chemistry by taking medication. Okay, all sorts of limitations with that. You get significant side effects. Efficacy is very, very hit and miss. I think partly because we don't really understand the science of how these medications work. And it doesn't address the root cause. It only works whilst you're taking it. Okay. And if you've got a dysregulated nervous system, that's not going to fix the root cause. The other paradigm is the psychotherapeutic paradigm, which sees mental health challenges as issues of learnt behavior. And the solution is to unlearn the behavior, usually through some form of talking therapy. Right? But if you've got a dysregulated nervous system, okay, no amount of talking about it is gonna fix that for you. Okay. But the problem is we don't fit into either of those paradigms. So we haven't been adopted and or embraced by the psychiatric community or the psychotherapeutic community. Okay. Sorry.
Therefore, my question to you is: have you forged a path on your own, or yes? I guess that's my question, because I have a follow-up question, but
that is exactly what we've done. And we've tried all sorts of it. We've been around for 10 years. We've tried all sorts of angles. At one stage, I spoke to the Secretary of State for Health and said, what do you see as the role of NICE in innovation within the health service? Because, people like me, we experience NICE as being more focused on protecting vested interest and the status quo than they are in really embracing innovation and delivering better outcomes at lower cost. And he said, Stuart, I'm doing a speech on that next week. Okay, come, make sure you're there. Unfortunately, he resigned 2 days later. That was Sajid Javid. So what happens is every now and again, we think, okay, let's have a little run at the system here. So I've had similar discussions with the Adoption Support Fund, which is now called the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund, funded by the Department for Education. And I still haven't got a clear answer to the question, what is the clinical criteria to get an intervention on the list of interventions that fund will pay for? Okay. And who is the decision maker? I still haven't got a clear answer. And I've been working that one for 5 or 6 years. I've spoken with the ministers about it, and I still haven't got an answer. So, yeah, we've forged our own pathway, but we are very open to collaboration with the institutions with the existing institutions to help people with mental health issues.
So we're really familiar with neurofeedback. Obviously, you would expect us to be by virtue of the work that we're involved in and the platforms that that we can inform. And I think it's now become a peripheral trend. So you can buy a neurofeedback headband for menstrual, but it's just kind of like in terms of general understanding about neurofeedback. Is there a large amount of kind of, I think there's an education piece that's understood, but I also think there's a parallel piece that's around fear of someone actually, because the actual visual of any neurofeedback is quite a difficult one to anything that I've seen. It looks painful, alien, can you speak to a little bit about what you think the barriers to adoption are beyond the kind of like what you've said about siloed approaches to mental health?
That's interesting. I think the first thing to say is talking a bit about neurofeedback is a little bit like going into a restaurant and asking for some food, or going into a Belgian bar and asking for a beer. What I mean is there's lots of different flavors of neurofeedback. It's been around a while and it's developed in different directions. But what they all have in common is you're right, they all have in common, it's picking up the electrical activity in your brain, and it's doing some sort of processing on that data, and it's generating feedback back to your nervous system. Usually passively, through your eyes, through your ears, through touch. It's giving information back in through your senses. And you're right, in order to pick up that information, you need to put sensors on the head. And so you do need to have some sort of sensor or contraption on your head to pick up that information. Obviously, the people who approach us are not fearful because they're approaching they've got over that they have other questions like, well, the 2 questions that people have are, can you help me and can I trust you? Okay, and they ask those questions in different ways. Some people want to know, have you treated someone exactly like me? The other question might be asked by, what's your qualifications, or what's the research, or what's the evidence, or what's the success rate, that sort of thing. And I think the other thing is, as neurofeedback has there are approaches to neurofeedback which will try and push your brain one way or the other. So they will use operant conditioning, which is where it came from, where the idea is that if you reward behavior, it can be learned. So these approaches to neurofeedback might look at your brainwave patterns and might say, you haven't got enough beta, you've got too much alpha. So they might use neurofeedback protocols to try and push your brain to correct that imbalance. Okay. We don't do that. We've never done that. Those approaches, which are very, very popular and very, very common, are based on a couple of flawed concepts. One is the idea that there is such a thing as an average brain. Okay. The second is the fact that none of our clients come to us and say, I want to be more average. Okay. And thirdly, even if there were such a thing as average brain, and you had unusual patterns within your brainwave, within your brainwaves, that whole approach ignores the fact that might be a particular strength or a particular skill, okay, or some sort of compensatory mechanism that your brain has adopted. And I think one of the problems we've got is that there's a lot of people, selling neurofeedback who are using those sorts of approaches. The most contemporary approach, and it's not like brand spanking new. It continues to evolve, but it's been around for 10 years now. Okay. Doesn't try and push your brain one way or the other. It just gives your brain information. Okay. And I think when we explain that to people, that all we're doing is you're giving your brain information, then that helps to overcome that fear factor.
So as Emma said, we spent I've spent a lot of time working with Bessel. I've actually been to a neurofeedback secret meeting. I guess it was a secret meeting at the time. It's now no longer one because I'm talking about it on here. That happened in the Berkshires in the States, and we got together a whole group of policymakers from the States. We got together various different neurofeedback practitioners and people who've been working in this field for many, many years, whether they were using. There's always been politics in the neurofeedback space, certainly over in the States, because this type of machine or this type of wave is better than that type of wave, etc. And they kind of in-house fighting. And I think that's been one of the reasons that neurofeedback hasn't really kind of had the traction that perhaps it should have had in this space. But there is also, as I worked with Bessel around this thing, there is especially when neurofeedback, when it comes to working with trauma, because I think we can see the efficacy of it. There aren't enough studies done. Again, I think this is because of this in-house fighting that their studies haven't been done, but there have been some studies. But I think what I feel very strongly about is, as with any intervention for trauma or PTSD or anything, maybe not for trauma or PTSD, but certainly for childhood trauma or attachment trauma, what's really important is the therapeutic relationship between the person who is undergoing the neurofeedback and the clinician that's performing the neurofeedback. Often, certainly, in Germany, I know there are many people trained in neurofeedback that are not therapists. They are not mental health specialists. They can be engineers. They can be I don't know, any kind of was not therapists, basically. And my worry is that interventions without the therapeutic rigor around them, the integration that is required, will cause more damage than any benefits. How do you feel about that? Do you agree with that, or do you think these can
I
work?
agree. I agree with you that the therapeutic relationship, the people skills. Okay, I'm going to use it in the broadest sense. The people skills you cannot teach. Okay, we can teach anyone to operate neurofeedback equipment. We can teach anyone who's sort of qualified to, I think who's got sort of couple of A-level type, studies and examinations. We could teach those sorts of people the ins and outs of clinical practice, okay, the technical details of clinical practice, okay. What we can't teach them is those people skills, okay. So that's what we're looking for. But does that mean you need to be a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist with X number of years clinical experience to have those skills? I would say not.
I
It's just,
I
you know,
do I do actually agree with you. And we were talking about this separately with someone else about psychedelics actually. And I think it is the people skills. So you could be just a wonderful, caring, empathetic
mhm.
person that can maintain a relationship. But I think my point is that the relationship needs, do you agree that the relationship there needs to be some form of therapeutic relationship? It can't just be like, for example, let's relate it to psychedelics for now, and just say you can't just be in a cubicle hooked up to ketamine drip and with your trauma, and then be like in a white room hooked up to ketamine drip or hooked up to neurofeedback in a room on your own with whatever's happening, and then leave that room um and go and hope for the best. I mean, that's
You're
what
not.
I'm that's
I agree with you. You're not going to get the best results that way, and you could get some bad results that way. Um, I totally agree with you. I think the way I would summarize it is neurofeedback is a clinical process that uses technology. Some people make the mistake of thinking it is a technological process with clinical application, and you might just argue that's just semantics, that's changing the words around. But I think that's my summary of your point. It's a clinical process that uses technology, a bit like a stethoscope. Is a clinical process that uses technology. You need to know what you're listening for to use a stethoscope. Is a piece of technology. So I would agree with you. And those soft skills, I think they're the sort of things you can't teach. I wouldn't say they're unteachable, but we don't look for people who we have to teach those to. We look for people who already got those skills. And I totally agree with you. I think you can get some psychiatrists who got the people skills of a brick. Similarly, some psychotherapists have got the people skills of a brick.
Yeah. You need to be able to, I think, and that's, but for me, I think with any, and this is a thing, a word of caution I always have for anyone with any kind of new, or whether this is new or not, but interventions with trauma that could be used. I could buy myself a neurofeedback. I know I could buy myself a neurofeedback machine at home, put it on, learn how to do it, but then it would just be me and my neurofeedback machine and my trauma, and that's it. Like if I have attachment wounds that need working through, I need to have the neurofeedback, and I need to have the integration with a therapist or with some sort of therapeutic relationship. I see potentially more harm than good coming of it if I don't. That's my feeling um around it. But I also think that it's a shame that it hasn't, um, as I said, had the traction that I believe neurofeedback deserves. I think it's, as I said, for a lot of reasons. I think it's not the cheapest intervention for therapists to learn, have the training, and then buy the machine, and then then set it up. I think that's potentially what could be. But I think if people generally, like Emma said, were educated in understanding the benefits of neurofeedback with a therapist, then if everyone was asking for it, if everyone was going into their therapy session saying, well, I want to use neurofeedback because I know that it's going to really have so many benefits that I haven't been able to see, it's going to expedite what perhaps years and years in therapy. It will take years and years in therapy to get to a position of where, like, I believe if I have if I use neurofeedback, I could get to in a much quicker time frame. And I also think that's because what neurofeedback enables us to do is, as you mentioned, one of the things it enables us to do is calm our nervous system, to put us in a state that is open to processing the kind of things that we need to process in therapy as well, which I think often, if we're certainly traumatized individuals, our nervous systems are too dysregulated to even be able to talk or do any sort of therapy.
And we do need more tools that allow us to scale the amount of interventions that's needed to kind of facilitate the healing that's needed at a societal level. So I've always been a huge, I watched neurofeedback with interest, intrigue, and a lot of hope that this could become, accessible from a price point perspective and from a, if we've talked about this before, if you on every high street or in every town, there was the possibility to be able to access that safe utilization of that tool. I think the question is how you do that, how you build that understanding, how you create that sense of safety for people to lean in.
Yeah, and I think one of the ideas, I mean, my background in the electronic systems. I mean, I think one of the questions is, is the way to go to have it adopted as a third therapeutic intervention to the existing paradigms, okay, which is what we've been trying so far, okay, or is it, as you use the word, Emma, is it to introduce it as a tool that existing practitioners can utilize with all that clinical skill and expertise in the background, and we have an architecture in mind that would do exactly that. And I think when Araminta was just saying that there's not that many. It's a big step, I think is what you were saying, for an existing therapist to integrate neurofeedback into their practice. And we get people approach us all the time saying, what machine should I buy? And the first thing we say is, well, that's the wrong question. What you need to think about is what philosophy do you want to embrace, and then you can sort of think about what approach to take, and sometime after that you can actually think about what hardware and software you need to buy to support that. But one of the things I concluded is that it doesn't actually make any sense for a highly skilled therapist or psychiatrist to be delivering neurofeedback, because when you're doing that, you are spending 90% of your time looking at a computer screen. Okay, so the model has to be one where we can have sort of technician level people actually administering the service with that clinical expertise overseeing it. And there are ways, I think, that we can leverage the clinical expertise that is out there to allow us to scale this up in a way that can meet the need. So yeah, I agree with you, and I have some what I think are quite well developed thoughts along those lines, and currently trying to explore with one of the big universities you will have heard of to see whether there's a way to move that forward.
I think there's just a general need for awareness, and then education, and then advocacy, and then availability and accessibility. That's the kind of journey it's still so peripheral and still so kind of futuristic, I think, even though the science and the implementation has been around, it's that traction that's missing. I think we believe that it is a big part of the puzzle in solving the situations that we have, but it's a tough nut to crack. I'm conscious of timings, so I'm going to ask you the question that we ask all of our podcast guests. And it's we don't give it in advance because it is a big, lofty question, but the best answers always just come from your intuition or your gut. And I think I probably know the answer based on our conversation, but we'll go there anyway, which is, whether at a kind of small level around us as individuals with our family and colleague and friendship and community groups, or right up to that macro picture of, geopolitical climate crises. We live in a heightened state of anxiety and fear and doubt. If there was a single lever for change that would be the catalyst for a shift in the way that we are living, what would that lever be?
If I had a lever that could inject that could remove the shackles from the institutions which govern our systems, in its broadest sense. Okay, then that I think would open up the imagination. Because I think if the will was there, if the way is there, if the will was there to transform the way we see these challenges and the way we deal with these challenges, I come back. I've read an awful lot about innovation and some of the challenges that innovators have had over the years. They often say that, the way to, predict the future is to look at the past. And you see it played out over and over again with people who are trying to innovate. The fact that they introduced gas-powered record players, to resist the revolution that electricity represented. It just shows you the lengths to which institutions and organizations will go to resist something which upsets the status quo. I think that's what we need to change. Inject or remove the shackles of status quoism that currently paralyze our institutions.
I think that's a great answer. Yeah, we see that it's the same with the clinical application of psychedelics. It's just consistently held back by that. Yeah, great. Thanks, Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much.